The Galactic Military Coordination Initiative had many accomplishments to its name: 17 successful peacekeeping operations, 43 diplomatic resolutions, an impressive cafeteria menu that accommodated 78 different digestive systems. What it did not have, apparently, was the collective common sense to avoid setting up a forward observation camp on Ketris 9 during storm season. Ketris 9 was what happened when a planet looked at the concept of habitable and decided that was for quitters. It was technically classified as having breathable atmosphere, which was like calling a tiger technically a cat. Sure, you could breathe there. You could also breathe in a meat locker during a blizzard while someone threw knives at you, and that would be approximately the same experience with better odds of survival. The planet's surface was 97% glacial ice, 2% exposed rock that was somehow even colder than the ice, and 1% scientific points of interest, which was military speak for reasons we're sending you to freeze your appendages off. The specific appendages varied by species, but the freezing was universal. The observation camp sat on the Norvac Glacier, a massive sheet of ice that moved approximately 3 centimeters per year and had the aesthetic appeal of a frozen parking lot stretching to every horizon. The camp consisted of 12 modular habitats, each supposedly rated for temperatures down to -80 degrees Celsius. The operative word being supposedly, much like the expedition was supposedly scheduled outside of storm season. Lieutenant Commander Vexthor of the Zentari Imperial Guard stood in the command habitat, his 4 eyes scanning readouts that told him things he already knew and didn't want confirmed. Zentari had evolved on a desert world where water appeared as vapor or not at all. Ice was a theoretical concept they'd encountered in textbooks. The fact that Vexthor was currently standing on several kilometers of it made his scales itch in ways that violated multiple laws of physics. Weather satellite shows clear conditions for the next 72 hours, announced Ensign Krilth, a Votaxian whose species hailed from a pleasantly temperate world with reasonable weather patterns and sensible seasons. Her translator unit rendered her chittering into something resembling optimism, though the device struggled with sarcasm. The same satellite that predicted clear conditions yesterday asked Corporal then, a Brelix who'd been complaining about the cold since they'd landed 3 days ago. Brelix generated heat through crystalline matrices in their bodies that allegedly made them naturally adapted to temperature extremes. What the biology text forgot to mention was that those matrices worked significantly worse when the ambient temperature dropped below the freezing point of most known fluids. The human sat in the corner, doing what humans always seemed to do in military operations, absolutely nothing that looked productive while somehow remaining completely alert. Private First Class Marcus Webb had the particular slouched posture of someone who'd been in the service long enough to know that looking busy was amateur hour. He was running a whetstone along a combat knife with the kind of methodical patience that suggested either deep meditation or profound boredom. Webb Vexthor said, because someone had to acknowledge the human before it got weird. It always got weird with humans if you ignored them too long. Sir Webb responded without looking up from his knife. You have experience with cold weather operations. Some. Webb tested the blade's edge with his thumb, nodded, and started on the other side. Some, Vexthor repeated, consulting his datapad. Your file indicates you completed survival training in the Arctic regions of Earth. Yep. And training in the Antarctic regions. Yep. And a classified operation on Hoth 7. Can't talk about that one, sir, on account of it being classified. Webb's tone suggested he found this tremendously amusing for reasons he wasn't going to share. The thing about humans was that they came from a planet that couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Earth had deserts that could cook meat on rocks and tundras that made Ketris 9 look temperate. It had oceans that could crush submarines and mountains where the air was too thin to breathe. And somehow, humans had looked at all of that environmental hostility and decided to live everywhere anyway, out of spite or stupidity, or some combination that the galaxy's xenobiologists were still trying to understand. The reason I mention it, Vexthor continued, is that you don't seem concerned about our current situation. Should I be concerned about something specific, sir, or just concerned in general? Because I can do either, but I'd like to know which one we're going for. Before Vexthor could decide whether that was insubordination or just human communication patterns, the temperature alarm started screaming. The thing about weather on Ketris 9 was that it didn't gradually get worse. It went from technically survivable to aggressively trying to kill you with the kind of speed usually reserved for military coups and food poisoning. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in 15 minutes, then another 20 in the next 10 minutes. The wind picked up from annoying to capable of sandblasting with ice crystals in the time it took Vexthor to pull up the weather data and realize the satellite had been lying through whatever sensors it used for lying. Storm system appeared from nowhere, Krilth announced, which was helpful in the way that announcing a fire while standing in burning building was helpful. Temperature dropping past -90, wind speeds exceeding 200 kilometers per hour. Seal the habitats, Vexthor ordered. Emergency power to heating systems. Standard cold weather protocol. What followed was a masterclass in how things that worked perfectly in simulations could fail spectacularly in reality. The habitat seals, rated for extreme cold, turned out to have been tested in extreme cold that meant -40 degrees. -90 was apparently a different beast entirely. The seals held, technically, but the gaps between modules started accumulating ice faster than the heating systems could compensate. The Zentari's cold weather gear, which had cost the Imperial Guard approximately 17,000 credits per unit, began failing within the first hour. Turned out that gear designed for desert-dwelling reptilians in cold weather was mostly theoretical, designed by engineers who'd never actually been cold and tested by soldiers who thought 5 degrees above freezing was pretty chilly. Then's crystalline matrices started dimming, which was the Brelic's equivalent of hypothermia, and looked disturbingly like watching a living lava lamp slowly turn off. 2 other Brelic soldiers were already showing the same symptoms, their bodies unable to generate enough heat to maintain their core functions when the ambient temperature was busy trying to achieve absolute zero out of pure malice. The Votaxian soldiers were faring slightly better, mainly because their fur provided actual insulation, but slightly better still meant slowly freezing, rather than rapidly freezing. Krill's chittering had taken on a slower, more labored quality that the translator was rendering as slurred speech. "Communications are down," someone announced. Of course they were. The communication relay was outside, and the ice was accumulating on it at a rate that suggested the universe had personal grievances against electromagnetic signals. "Supply cache locations?" Vexthor asked. Buried came the response. "Ice accumulation is 0.7 meters per hour. The cache beacons aren't transmitting through it." Webb stood up, stretched with the kind of casual movement that suggested he wasn't particularly bothered by any of this, and walked to the habitat's small window. Outside was white. Not snow white or ice white, but the kind of absolute white that happened when frozen water moved horizontally at speeds that made direction a theoretical concept. "How long until rescue?" Vexthor asked. 72 hours minimum, Krilth said. "Storm interference means nothing can fly." Ground vehicles would take 8 days from the nearest base. We have 48 hours of heating power at current consumption, someone else added, because apparently this situation needed more bad news to really complete the experience. Vexthor looked around the habitat at his squad. 12 soldiers from 6 different species, all of whom were slowly realizing that they might have made a significant career error. The Brelics were dimming. The Votaxians were shivering so hard their fur was vibrating. Even Vexthor could feel his scales losing their flexibility, becoming brittle in the way that preceded serious cold damage. Then there was Webb, who'd walked back from the window and was now sorting through his pack with the kind of focused attention most species reserved for religious ceremonies or tax preparation. "Webb," Vexthor said, "you have something to contribute." "Working on it, sir." "Working on what exactly?" "A solution to our immediate problem of freezing to death, sir." "Give me 10 minutes." Webb pulled out several items from his pack: a collapsible shovel, a small welding torch, 2 emergency flares, what looked like a climbing pick, and a length of synthetic rope. He arranged them on the floor like he was preparing for surgery or assembling a bomb. With humans, both scenarios were equally probable. "Private Webb," Vexthor said, using his command voice that had once made a Korthan warlord reconsider his life choices, "what are you planning?" Webb looked up, and for the first time since the storm hit, he smiled. It was the kind of smile that made other species nervous, because human smiles could mean anything from "I've had a pleasant thought" to "I'm about to do something that violates the Geneva Conventions." "Sir, I'm going to dig a tunnel into the glacier." The habitat went quiet, except for the wind screaming outside, and then's crystalline matrices making crackling sounds of distress. "You're going to do what?" Vexthor said. "Dig a tunnel into the ice, specifically under this habitat, and then branching out to create an insulated shelter system inside the glacier itself." "That's..." Krill started, then stopped, then started again. "That's insane." "Little bit," Webb agreed cheerfully. "But here's the thing. That glacier under us? It's not as cold as the air. The ice is sitting at about -30 degrees, which is practically tropical compared to what's happening up here. If I can get us inside the glacier, we'll actually be warmer." "How?" Vexthor said slowly. "Do you plan to dig through ice? In these conditions?" Webb held up the welding torch. "Heat and percussion. Melt a starter hole. Chip away the softened ice. Repeat. It'll be slow for the first bit, but once I get deep enough to be out of the wind, it gets easier. That will take hours." "Yep." "You'll freeze." "Probably not. Humans generate a lot of waste heat when we work. It's a whole thing. Our evolutionary solution to temperature regulation was to just sweat when we're hot and shiver when we're cold, and somehow that works well enough that we never bothered developing anything more sophisticated." "This plan is ridiculous," Vexthor said. "Sir, with respect, we're on a frozen death planet in a storm that appeared from nowhere. Our gear is failing, and rescue is 3 days away. Ridiculous is kind of where we're at. I'm just suggesting we lean into it." Vexthor looked at his squad. The Brelics were barely conscious. The Votaxians were huddling together for warmth that none of them had to spare. He looked at the power readouts showing heating systems draining their reserves at an unsustainable rate. "Proceed," he said, because sometimes command meant authorizing insanity and hoping it worked. Webb nodded, grabbed his equipment, and headed for the airlock. "Going to need someone to let me back in periodically. Every 20 minutes or so, I'll knock. Don't make me wait, because standing still is when the cold gets you." He cycled through the airlock, and the squad watched through the window as he emerged into the storm. The wind hit him hard enough that he staggered, and for a moment it looked like Ketris 9 was going to claim its first victim. Then Webb leaned into the wind, drove his shovel into the ice at the habitat's foundation, and started digging. What followed was 4 hours of watching a human do something that shouldn't have been possible. Webb moved like a machine that had been programmed for one purpose and was too stubborn to acknowledge that physics disagreed with its programming. He used the welding torch to melt small sections of ice, then chipped away at the softened area with the shovel and pick, creating a depression in the glacier's surface. Every 20 minutes, he'd knock on the airlock. They'd cycle him in, and he'd stand there for exactly 90 seconds, breathing hard, ice coating every surface of his cold weather gear. He'd drink water from a heated canteen, flex his fingers to keep circulation going, and then head back out. He didn't complain, didn't ask how the others were doing, just worked with the kind of methodical determination that made Vexthor reconsider several assumptions about human psychology. The squad took turns watching through the small window, though there wasn't much to see beyond a human-shaped figure, repeatedly striking ice, in conditions that should have killed him within the first 30 minutes. Krilth started keeping a log of Webb's breaks, noting his condition each time he came inside. The pattern was disturbingly consistent, cold but functional, no signs of frostbite, breathing elevated but controlled, core temperature somehow stable, despite working in temperatures that would have flash-frozen most species' blood. "His metabolism is insane," Krilth muttered, checking her readings for the 3rd time. "He's burning calories at a rate that should be impossible. Where is he getting the energy?" "Humans are persistence hunters," Vexthor said, remembering a lecture from xenobiology training. "They evolved to chase prey for days until it collapsed from exhaustion. Apparently that same biology makes them unreasonably good at physical labor in hostile conditions. That's not evolution, that's a design flaw that somehow worked," then said, his glow flickering weakly. After 2 hours, Webb had disappeared entirely. The hole he'd created went straight down past the habitat's foundation and into the glacier itself. The squad could hear him working through the ice, the sound of metal on frozen water creating a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. Inside the habitat, the temperature continued to drop as their heating systems fought a losing battle against the storm. The power consumption meters ticked down with the inevitability of a countdown timer. Vexthor did the math in his head and didn't like the answer. They had maybe 36 hours of power left, and that was if they shut down everything except life support and heating. Rescue was still more than 2 days away. 3 hours in, Webb knocked on the airlock with a different pattern. When they let him in, he was covered in ice but grinning like he'd won a prize. "Tunnel's viable," he announced. "Got about 15 meters in, and I've hit ice that's cold but stable. I'm going to start the lateral expansion, create some chambers. But here's the thing, we need to start the fire." "Fire," Vexthor repeated. "In an ice tunnel." "Controlled fire, sir. This is the clever bit." Webb pulled out a small diagram he'd sketched on a piece of paper that was already getting damp. "I create chambers in the ice. We light fires in those chambers using fuel from our supplies. The heat melts the surrounding ice very slowly, creating larger chambers and smooth walls. The meltwater runs down and refreezes at the bottom as our drainage. Meanwhile, we're in insulated ice caves with heat sources, protected from the wind and surviving in relative comfort." "That's," Krilth said, and her translator unit struggled for a moment. "Actually brilliant. It's also completely insane." Then added, his crystalline matrices flickering weakly. "Can be both," Webb said. "But we need to move people soon. Another hour, and we won't have the power to keep the habitats warm anyway. At least in the ice we're using fuel that burns, not electrical heating. We can stretch our supplies longer." Vexthor made the decision that would either save them all or kill them faster. Begin evacuation. Ambulatory personnel help those who need assistance. Webb, lead the way. They went into the glacier in order of who was coldest. The Brelics went first, being carried by others, their bodies barely generating light anymore. Then the Votaxians, stumbling and shivering. The Zentari, scales brittle and movement sluggish. Vexthor went last, because that's what commanders did, even when every instinct screamed that the ice was death and they were crawling into their own tomb. The tunnel was narrow and dark, lit only by emergency lights that Webb had placed every few meters. The walls were rough, where he'd been working fastest, and smooth, where he'd had time to do it properly. It angled down steeply for the first 10 meters, then leveled out and branched. The chambers Webb had carved were crude but functional. Each was roughly 3 meters in diameter, with a curved ceiling and a slightly raised floor to keep them above any meltwater. Webb had already set up the first fire in the primary chamber, using solid fuel tablets from the emergency supplies arranged in a small metal container that vented through a crude chimney he'd somehow carved upward through the ice. The heat was immediate and shocking. Not warm, exactly, but not the lethal cold of the surface. -30 degrees felt like a tropical paradise when you'd been slowly freezing at -120. How? Vexthor asked, watching the fire burn without melting the entire structure down around them. Ice is an excellent insulator when it's this cold, Webb explained, setting up a second fire in another chamber. The fire heats the air in the chamber, but the ice itself is so far below freezing that it takes forever to melt. What does melt just makes the walls smoother and refreezes lower down. As long as we keep the fires small and controlled, we're actually safer here than we would be in the habitats. This shouldn't work, Krilth said, but she was holding her hands near the fire with the kind of devotion usually reserved for religious icons. Yeah, well, tell that to my ancestors who survived ice ages by doing exactly this. Webb said, humans have been hiding in ice caves with fires since before we invented the wheel. It's traditional. Over the next 6 hours, Webb expanded the tunnel system to include 5 chambers, each with its own fire, connected by passages that allowed air circulation but kept the heat from dissipating too quickly. He worked with the same relentless efficiency he'd shown digging the initial tunnel, pausing only to drink water and rotate personnel through the chambers to ensure everyone got time near the fires. The transformation was remarkable. The Brelics began glowing again, their matrices absorbing the thermal energy and slowly returning to full luminescence. The Votaxians stopped shivering, their fur drying out and fluffing up to provide better insulation. Vexthor felt his scales regaining flexibility, the brittle stiffness fading as his body temperature stabilized. Webb had even carved small alcoves into the walls for storing supplies and sleeping, creating a surprisingly livable space inside what should have been a tomb of ice. He showed them how to maintain the fires, how to monitor the ventilation to prevent carbon monoxide buildup, and how to manage the meltwater drainage so they didn't end up sleeping in puddles. You've done this before, Vexthor observed, watching Webb adjust the fire in the main chamber with practiced ease. Not exactly like this, sir, but the principles are the same. Cold is cold, ice is ice, and fire is fire. You just have to respect all three and make them work together instead of fighting each other. Outside, the storm raged for another 53 hours. The wind speeds peaked at 240 kilometers per hour. The temperature bottomed out at -137 degrees, cold enough that the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere started forming dry ice crystals that fell like snow made of frozen ghost breath. Inside the glacier, 12 soldiers from 6 species survived in ice caves carved by a human who'd apparently decided that thermodynamics were suggestions rather than laws. They played cards using a deck Webb had in his pack. They shared stories about their home worlds and complained about military food with the universal camaraderie of soldiers who'd survived something they shouldn't have. They took turns maintaining the fires and monitoring the tunnel integrity, following Webb's instructions with the kind of trust that came from seeing someone perform the impossible and make it look routine. When the rescue ships finally arrived, the pilots found the habitats frozen solid, their heating systems depleted, and their interiors coated with ice. The emergency beacons were silent. For 20 minutes, the rescue team assumed they were recovering bodies and prepared themselves for the grim task of explaining to command how an entire squad had been lost to bad weather and worse planning. Then someone noticed smoke venting from holes in the glacier's surface, which made no sense whatsoever. Smoke implied fire. Fire implied someone was alive to tend it. But how could anyone survive inside a glacier in conditions that had frozen military-grade habitats solid? They followed the smoke, found the tunnel entrance, and discovered an entire squad living in relative comfort inside chambers carved from ice and heated by controlled fires. The squad was playing cards and complaining about the food, because apparently surviving the unsurvivable gave you certain privileges when it came to military cuisine criticism. The official report struggled with the explanation. The commanding officer of the rescue operation read it 3 times, consulted 2 engineers and a physicist, and finally just wrote "human improvisation" in the incident summary because no other phrase adequately captured what had happened. Webb received a commendation for creative problem-solving under extreme conditions, which was military speak for "we don't understand what you did, but everyone lived, so we're not going to ask too many questions." He also received a bill for the fuel tablets used in the fires, because the military maintained certain traditions regardless of circumstances. The bill was later waived after Vextor submitted a formal protest that included the phrase "sending invoices to soldiers who prevented mass casualties demonstrates a level of bureaucratic tone deafness that deserves its own special commendation." Vextor filed his own report that included the phrase "humanity's approach to environmental hostility appears to be based on spite and improvisation in equal measure." He also requested that all future cold weather operations include at least 1 human, preferably one with Webb's particular brand of cheerful insanity. The request was approved, though the official response noted that cheerful insanity was not recognized as a formal qualification in military personnel files. Ketris 9 continued being a frozen nightmare of a planet that no sane species would willingly visit. The observation camp was relocated to a more sensible location, by which the military meant anywhere else. The tunnels Webb carved remained in the glacier, slowly collapsing and reforming with the ice's natural movement, a temporary monument to human stubbornness that would eventually disappear into the geological record. And somewhere in the Galactic Military Coordination Initiative's vast database of incident reports and lessons learned, a new entry appeared in the section on survival training. It read, "In extreme cold weather situations, consider consulting human personnel before attempting standard protocols. Humans have survived ice ages. Your species probably hasn't. This matters more than you think." The entry included a footnote, added by an unknown administrator with a sense of humor. Note, human solutions may involve fire, ice, and logic that seems contradictory until it works. This is normal. Do not panic. Let them cook, metaphorically and literally. The galaxy, in its infinite wisdom and diversity, had many species adapted to many environments. But only one species had looked at a glacier during a storm that could freeze nitrogen and decided the solution was to dig into it and start a fire. The fact that this solution had worked was either a testament to human ingenuity or evidence that the universe had a sense of humor about the laws of physics. Probably both. And somewhere in the universe, on another frozen rock that some military planner had deemed strategically important, another human was probably doing something equally impossible and making it look like standard operating procedure. Because that was what humans did. They looked at hostile environments, inadequate equipment, and impossible odds, and decided that impossible just meant nobody had been stubborn enough yet. The rest of the galaxy was still learning this lesson, slowly, one frozen disaster at a time.